I went to an auction as a waitress. I walked out as someone's purchase. The man who bid didn't hesitate. A single gesture, one strike of the gavel, and my life split in two before I could take a breath. When he stepped close, his voice landed low and warm, as though he already knew what it would do to me. "Tonight you're mine, and there's nowhere to run." I froze, not because of fear, but because I already knew him, and he had no idea. Chapter 1. The Auction. The waitress dress didn't fit, not even close. I'd squeezed myself into a borrowed waitress outfit, at least 2 sizes too small, and slipped through the service door of a mansion that reeked of generational wealth and buried sins. A stupid plan by every measure. But when your debt sits at 200,000 Rs and your creditors prefer sending threats over sending invoices, you grab a tray of champagne and walk in smiling. That was the strategy. The whole strategy. I kept telling myself that, as I wove between men whose suits alone could cover a full year of my law tuition, keeping my eyes low and my expression neutral. I didn't know what kind of event this was. I only knew I wasn't supposed to be here, and honestly, that was already more than I wanted to know on a Thursday night. The air in the room felt heavy, though not from the temperature. The climate control hummed with that invisible perfection only serious money can buy. No, the weight came from something else. From the particular silence that settles when dangerous people occupy the same space, and every word left unspoken carries a cost. I was halfway across the floor when I finally understood what kind of auction this was. The raised platforms near the back wall didn't hold paintings or sculptures. They held people, women. Some stood with the practiced composure of those who knew exactly what they'd walked into. Others wore the same hollow look I could feel spreading through my gut. I froze mid-step, first mistake of the evening, and nearly lost my grip on the tray when a man in a gray suit seized my arm with a politeness that fooled no one. "You're late," he whispered, like we'd met before. "I'm with the catering staff. Platform 3. Move." I didn't even get the chance to assemble a proper legal objection. Kidnapping, coercion, a handful of constitutional violations, 3 years of law school, and not a single useful word came out. Before I was shoved onto an elevated stage alongside 4 women who carried themselves like runway models. I was wearing white rubber sneakers beneath my uniform. Things couldn't possibly get worse. Then the rear door swung open. It wasn't loud. It wasn't anything I could pin down in concrete terms, because the shift wasn't physical. It was atmospheric. The air itself seemed to tighten, to stand at attention. Conversations died mid-syllable. Men who'd had their backs turned now faced the entrance. And I, who should have been calculating the fastest route off that platform, went absolutely still. He walked in like the room had been waiting for permission to exist. Tall, broad shoulders filling his jacket with the effortless authority of someone who'd never once tried to look intimidating. It just happened. Dark hair, eyes that appeared gray from a distance, but I knew, with a certainty that defied every rational thought, were a blue so intense they edged toward violet under the right light. Nikolai Volkov. His name surfaced before I could block it, the way it always did. Uninvited, unannounced, carrying that aching familiarity of things you bury but never actually lose. They stay lodged somewhere deeper than conscious memory can reach. My heart lurched. Not a beat, a recognition. The involuntary reflex of a body remembering something the mind has spent years trying to discard. He didn't know me. I was certain of that too. Nikolai Volkov was 32, ran half the Russian Mafia's operations across the southern hemisphere, and had likely ruined more lives than he bothered to track. He wouldn't recall some reckless teenager who'd stumbled across his path years ago, under circumstances I had no intention of revisiting, but I remembered him, every detail. And right now, standing on that platform in a too-tight uniform with an auction underway, that memory was the single most dangerous thing in my life, more dangerous than the debt, the stage, or the armed men lining the walls. His gaze moved across the room with no hurry, scanning faces with the patience of a man who never needed to rush, because the world adjusted to his rhythm. Then, without build-up, without warning, his eyes found mine. They didn't drift. They locked. Long enough that it couldn't be coincidence. Brief enough that I couldn't swear it happened. The auctioneer began calling numbers. Bids floated through the air with the casual ease of a stock exchange, as if the figures attached to human beings were just another line on a portfolio. I should have screamed, should have declared who I was, should have done anything a third-year law student with a head full of human rights theory would do in a moment like this. Instead, I watched Nikolai Volkov lift his hand. Once. A single, unhurried motion. The gavel came down before another voice could speak. The man in the gray suit reappeared at my side, smiling a smile that never touched his eyes. "Lucky you," he said, as though he were paying me a compliment. I felt nothing close to lucky. Nikolai crossed the distance between us in long, measured steps, the kind of walk that belongs to someone trained to eliminate unnecessary movement. Up close, he was worse. Not because of the threat he radiated, though that was undeniable. It was something in the structure of his face, in the way he studied me without the faintest trace of a smile, that made my instincts split in half. One half screaming to run, the other rooted in place, leaning closer. "I don't spend money on things I don't plan to keep." His voice was low, stripped of decoration, a fact, not a warning. And I, armed with 23 years of life experience and 3 years of legal education, answered, "Perfect, because I don't stay anywhere against my will." A few men nearby laughed, some genuinely amused, others with the kind of laugh that comes right before something ugly. Nikolai did neither. His head shifted a fraction to the side, barely perceptible, and he looked at me with an expression I couldn't decode, like he was turning over a piece that didn't fit the puzzle. He lifted his hand and touched my chin, not roughly, just enough pressure to angle my face toward the light, the gesture of someone inspecting a half-remembered thing, trying to decide whether the recognition is real or invented. My stomach plummeted, because I knew that touch, that exact motion, that precise weight of fingers against skin. I knew it. And he stood close enough that I could feel the warmth bleeding through his suit, could trace the sharp line where his jaw met his neck, could see the instant something flickered behind his eyes, a ghost of recognition, a doubt that formed and dissolved before it became anything solid. He almost remembered, but he didn't. And what he did next was the quietest, coldest, most irreversible decision I'd ever witnessed someone make. "You're coming with me," Nikolai said. He dropped his hand, turned away, as if the outcome had been decided long before the conversation started. I stood frozen for 3 full seconds, long enough to count at least 8 men positioned between me and every possible exit, all of them built for the sole purpose of stopping exactly what I was considering. And then I followed him, because sometimes the only way out runs straight through the worst possible direction. And because somewhere deep in the part of me I never let speak, a small, reckless, entirely irrational voice had been waiting for this exact moment for years. I knew who he was. He had no idea who I was. And the day he remembered, nothing between us would survive unchanged. Chapter 2. The Mansion. I should have recognized the warning signs when Carla called me at 11 at night, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who's already done something terrible and hasn't yet figured out how to confess. "Livia, I need to tell you something." Carla had been my closest friend since we were 15. She knew where I used to hide my diary, still had photos I wished didn't exist. She was also, as I pieced together that night while being led through the marble corridors of Nikolai Volkov's mansion, the entire reason I'd spent the last 2 hours standing on an auction platform in white rubber sneakers. The story was uncomplicated in the way that cruel things often are. Carla had debts, not the kind you settle with a bank or a finance company, the kind you owe to people who skip the paperwork and go straight to consequences. She'd gotten tangled up with the wrong man in an arrangement that went south fast, and when the number climbed beyond anything she could speak aloud, someone from Volkov's operation came to her with a proposition. They needed a young woman for a particular auction. Pretty, no powerful family behind her, no one likely to raise difficult questions. Carla thought of herself first. She had always thought of herself first. I'd known that since we were 15, and had chosen to love her anyway. The difference this time was that she thought of herself, then looked in my direction, and those 2 impulses collided somewhere very dark. I was placed on that platform instead of her. I learned all of this through a string of voice messages she sent while I sat in the back of Nikolai's car, my phone wedged beneath my thigh at an angle the driver couldn't catch in the mirror, my face turned toward the window in a performance of calm I absolutely did not feel. Her last message dissolved into sobbing. I switched off the phone before the tears could soften me. Pity could wait. Anger was sharper, and right now I needed the edge. The mansion was everything I would have predicted and still nothing I could absorb. It was large the way old estates are large, not built to impress, but by people who never once entertained the idea of needing less room. Corridors fed into rooms that opened onto more corridors. Tall windows hung with heavy curtains that blocked the light but let the cold seep through. A central staircase rose to the 2nd floor with the quiet authority of something that has never needed to explain itself. I catalogued every detail as I followed Nikolai upstairs. Side exit to the left, security camera in the corner, hallway window, Iron bars on the outside, old enough that some joints might be weak. Service stairs near the back. No visible camera, which felt less like an oversight and more like an invitation to make a mistake. Law student with a talent for bad decisions. That's what I was. He stopped before a door and pushed it open without ceremony. The room was twice the size of my entire apartment, furnished in that deliberate emptiness rich people mistake for taste. A wide bed, a bathroom behind a glass partition, a window overlooking manicured gardens lit from below. "This is yours," Nikolai said. He still hadn't looked at me directly. "Mine as in temporarily, or mine as in indefinitely," he turned then. Studied me with that expression I was beginning to file under the look of a man who can't fathom why you're still speaking. The rules are straightforward. Don't run. Don't lie. Don't provoke. I let the quiet stretch one beat longer than comfortable. "Then you picked exactly the wrong person." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. Nikolai Volkov seemed to have an uneasy relationship with smiling, but something adjacent. A micro-adjustment at the corner of his mouth. A faint narrowing of his eyes. As though my answer had arrived from a direction he hadn't been watching. He walked out without another word. The door stayed unlocked. That was either supreme confidence or a carefully laid trap, and I'd need a full night's sleep before I could tell the difference. I didn't get a full night's sleep. I managed 2 hours, woke to my stomach in revolt, and spent the next half hour confirming what I'd already suspected. A small camera sat in the upper right corner of the room, tucked behind a decorative molding that would fool anyone who wasn't specifically hunting for surveillance. I was specifically hunting for surveillance. The real problem was hunger. And the problem with that problem was that I had no idea where the kitchen was, no one to ask, and a stubborn pride that apparently crumbled at 4 a.m. when my body decided it had waited long enough. I stepped into the hallway. It stretched out dark and silent, not the silence of emptiness, but the dense, textured quiet that fills large houses after midnight. I descended the staircase, passed through 2 rooms that offered nothing edible, and found the kitchen on my 3rd attempt. It was enormous, spotless, outfitted with motion sensor lighting that flared on the instant I crossed the threshold, and left me blinking like a startled animal. The pantry alone was the size of my bathroom back home. I was weighing my options between imported cheese and what looked like leftovers from a dinner that probably cost more than my monthly groceries, when a voice landed behind me. "What are you doing?" Flat, not a question. The tone of someone who already has the answer, and is simply giving you the rope to hang yourself with. I turned slowly, cheese in hand, and found Nikolai Volkov leaning against the door frame, arms folded, wearing an expression that made it clear he'd been watching at least part of my midnight expedition before deciding to reveal himself. "I was hungry," I said, summoning whatever dignity the moment still allowed. "You could have asked." "Asked who?" "It's 4 a.m. and I don't know a single person in this house." "You could have waited. I could have done a lot of things." I set the cheese down on the counter with care. "But hunger doesn't consult anyone's schedule." He watched me for a beat, not measuring anything physical, not my height, not my posture, but something else, something internal I couldn't name. Then he crossed to the refrigerator, opened it, pulled out a covered plate, and slid it across the counter toward me. "From dinner," he said. I didn't ask how he knew the leftovers were there, didn't ask why he was awake at this hour, didn't ask anything at all, because questions demand answers, and answers demand conversation, and conversation with Nikolai Volkov at 4 a.m. in his own kitchen seemed like a road that led somewhere I wasn't prepared to go. I ate in silence. He stayed on the opposite side of the counter, gaze fixed on some indefinite point above my head, and the whole scene carried a strange domesticity that clashed violently with everything that had happened since the auction. "You were watching on the cameras," I said when I finished. A statement, not an accusation. "Yes. And you found it funny." A pause. "I found it interesting." Interesting. The word landed differently than I expected. Heavier, more deliberate. Not interesting as in entertaining. Interesting as in a problem worth examining closely. I cleared the plate, washed it without being asked, and when I turned to leave, he was still in the same spot, still studying me with that unreadable expression. "Why didn't you run when you had the chance?" he asked. The question, plain, direct, entirely unexpected, struck the exact place where I stored things I didn't want to look at. Because the honest answer was too layered for 4 a.m. It involved years and memories and a fury I'd shaped so meticulously over time that I sometimes mistook it for who I was. "Still doing the math," I said. I left without waiting for his reply. But as I climbed the staircase, I knew with an irrational, baseless certainty that he stood there watching me, until I vanished around the corner, and that knowledge was precisely the kind of thing I preferred not to examine. Over the next 3 days, we fell into a routine so absurd it became almost normal, the way absurdity always does when you're living inside it. I explored the mansion within boundaries that seemed generous, until I realized they'd been engineered so precisely that I could never quite tell where they ended. Nikolai materialized at unpredictable moments. No announcement, no footsteps, just that atmospheric shift that rearranged the air before I even registered his presence. He watched far more than he spoke. I talked far more than necessary whenever I was nervous, and Nikolai Volkov made me nervous in ways I refused to honestly confront. One afternoon, while I sat in the library turning pages without absorbing a word, a memory surfaced uninvited. A different corridor, darker. A younger man, same broad shoulders, same way of claiming space as though the space had no say in the matter. And me, younger too, reckless with that particular bravery teenagers carry before they learn which things actually deserve fear. Me following him unaware, then aware. Then, I shut the book harder than I meant to. The sound cracked through the empty library, and when I looked up, Nikolai stood in the doorway. He didn't ask what was wrong, but his eyes lingered a second longer than usual, carrying that same flicker of half-formed recognition I'd seen at the auction, as if something hovered at the far edge of his memory, refusing to solidify. Not yet, and I needed to decide, before that moment arrived, what I would do when it did, because he still didn't know who I was, but I knew exactly what he had done. And some wounds don't heal just because time moves forward. They wait, patient and quiet, for the precise moment to open again. Chapter 3. The Dangerous Seduction. I made the mistake of wearing the red dress on Thursday. It wasn't deliberate, or so I kept telling myself while sorting through the clothes that had materialized in the bedroom closet on the second morning. No explanation, no label, every piece in my exact size. The dress was simple, cut close to the body, with an open back that dipped 2 fingers past what anyone would call safe. I chose it because it was the only thing in there that didn't seem designed to make me disappear. I only understood my error when I reached the bottom of the staircase and found Nikolai in the hallway. He had his back to me, speaking Russian into his phone, that low, cadenced Russian that sounded less like communication and more like a controlled threat. He turned at the sound of my steps and went completely still for 3 seconds before resuming the call as though nothing had shifted. But I caught it. I caught the precise instant his gaze dropped and climbed back, fast, disciplined, with the restraint of a man who'd spent a lifetime training himself not to react. And I caught the fraction of a degree his jaw tightened afterward, tiny, nearly invisible. I noticed because I'd been watching for things I had no business watching for. The problem with Nikolai Volkov was the way he filled a room in ways I wasn't equipped to handle. It wasn't only physical, though that was its own issue. The man had shoulders that could shrink a corridor. It was how he moved, every gesture pared down to only what was necessary, as if he'd auditioned each motion and cut the rest. It was how he looked at you, unhurried, unblinking, as though the act of seeing were something he chose to do rather than something that simply happened. And above everything, it was the way he closed distance without seeming to close it at all. Thursday afternoon, I was in the library trying to arrange my thoughts into something a lawyer could work with. Abduction, coercion, potential trafficking, how to find legal counsel who wouldn't flinch at the name Volkov, when he walked in and dropped into the armchair across the room without asking whether I wanted company. I waited for him to say something. He didn't. He read a document in Russian with the absolute focus of someone who doesn't lose concentration easily, and I pretended to read while my attention independently decided to trace the line of his profile against the window light. This went on for 40 minutes. 40 minutes of shared silence that felt nothing like the cold standoff I'd expected. It was almost comfortable, which unsettled me in a way I couldn't properly articulate. "You're not going to try talking," I finally said, because comfortable silence was more dangerous than hostility, and I needed to break it before it settled in. He lifted his gaze with that unhurried precision. "You'd prefer conversation. I'd prefer to understand what's going on. You're here. You're safe. You're being treated well. A beat. What else requires understanding?" "Why?" The word hung between us with a gravity its 3 letters had no right to carry. Nikolai studied me for a moment, that appraising look I was learning to identify, which meant I was paying him far too much attention, then returned to his document. "Because I wanted to," he said, simply, and the way he said it, not with arrogance, but with the plainness of a fact too obvious to need elaboration, stirred something in my stomach I chose to label as anger, rather than what it probably was. The provocation started without a plan. At least that's what I told myself. Friday night I discovered the mansion had a music room in the east wing, a grand piano, dimmed lighting, acoustics built to cradle sound. I hadn't touched a piano since I was 16, when my mother sold ours to cover a debt that wasn't hers. The first few minutes were an honest wreck, fingers that remembered position but had lost all fluency. Then it started to return. Old melodies, fragments. Muscle memory is relentless that way. It lodges itself in places conscious, forgetting can't reach. I didn't hear him come in. I only realized I wasn't alone when my fingers froze on their own. That primitive instinct of being observed that fires before any conscious thought. I turned slowly on the bench. Nikolai was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, in the posture of someone who'd arrived well before he intended to announce himself. "You play," he said. Not surprise. Registration. I used to. I faced the keys again. There's a difference. He entered the room with those deliberate strides that turned every movement into a verdict. He stopped behind me, not beside, behind, at a distance that sat precisely on the border between appropriate and unsettling, and said nothing. I could feel the warmth of his presence as if the air between us had developed a pulse of its own. "Continue," he said quietly. "You're giving me orders about music now. I'm asking." The distinction in his voice was razor thin, but it was there, and the fact that I'd detected it was information I would have preferred not to possess. I placed my hands on the keys again and began something slower, more intentional, irritatingly aware that I was playing differently because he was listening. He stayed behind me through the entire piece. When I finished, the silence stretched longer than it should have. Then he circled the bench and sat beside me, not at the far end, but close enough that our arms were separated by barely 2 centimeters, and stared at the keyboard with that sealed expression I couldn't crack. "My mother used to play," he said, low, eyes forward. I didn't know what to do with that. It was the first personal thing he'd offered in days, and it arrived with the fragile weight of something rarely spoken aloud. "Was she good?" I asked. "She was." A pause. "She died when I was 11. I stayed quiet. Some things don't need a reply. They need room to exist without being smothered by well-meaning words." He turned toward me, and suddenly we were far too close for the volume of things left unsaid between us. I could make out a faint scar near his left eyebrow, could register the exact moment his breathing slowed by a fraction. "You irritate me," he murmured, "as though you've done it before." The world stopped. Not theatrically. It stopped in the quiet, devastating way of things that change everything without making a sound. The sentence landed at the center of my chest and radiated outward, carrying that half-familiar sensation of hearing a song whose name you've lost, but whose every note you know by heart. He was nearly remembering. "Must be a natural gift," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. He held my gaze a moment past, comfortable. Then he rose, straightened his jacket with the automatic motion of someone who's worn armor so long they've stopped noticing, and moved toward the door. He paused at the threshold. "The red dress," he said, without turning around. "Don't wear it again." He was gone before I could answer. I sat staring at the piano keys for a long time after, my heart doing things I refused to acknowledge, trying to determine whether what I felt was triumph or surrender, and realizing the boundary between them was growing dangerously thin. I wore the red dress on Saturday. His reaction was more contained this time. He'd prepared. I could tell by the way he didn't let his gaze drop, by the barely visible effort to hold his eyes level with mine when we crossed paths in the morning hallway. So I decided that his control was precisely what I wanted to take apart, not out of cruelty, or not solely out of cruelty. It came from the specific need to know whether what I sensed between us was real, or something my own confused mind had manufactured. I spent the day in whatever room he occupied, close enough to register, far enough that he couldn't object. When he read, I asked about the document. When he worked, I commented on the weather with a manufactured innocence he clearly didn't buy, but couldn't challenge. In the afternoon, he stood near the main room window, phone pressed to his ear, that low Russian again, and I walked past him to retrieve a book from the opposite shelf. The space was wide enough, no reason to adjust course, but I passed too close, not by accident. He didn't interrupt the call, but his free hand, the one not holding the phone, dropped a few centimeters. An aborted motion caught mid-flight, as though an impulse had been intercepted by discipline before it could finish. He kept speaking Russian without glancing away from the window. I grabbed the wrong book and returned to the couch, pretending I'd noticed nothing. 15 minutes later, he ended the call, stood silent for a moment facing the garden, then crossed toward me with the quiet resolve of a decision already made. He stopped in front of the couch, looked down at me with that expression I couldn't decode, but that made my stomach clench. "Stand up," he said. "I'm reading." "Stand up, Livia." It was the first time he'd used my name. And the way he said it, no urgency, no anger, just that calm authority more disarming than any raised voice, did something I chose not to examine. I stood. He didn't move while I rose, which meant that when I was on my feet we occupied a distance that failed every reasonable definition of personal space. I could feel the heat pouring off him, could see the subtle rise and fall of his chest with each breath. "You're doing this deliberately," he said, low, too close. "Doing what? You know what. I'm reading a book and wearing a dress. If that constitutes provocation, the issue is yours." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger, something more intricate than anger, layered in ways I didn't have the vocabulary to name. He raised his hand slowly, too slowly for casual, too quickly for hesitation, and adjusted the dress strap that had slipped a fraction off my shoulder. His fingers brushed my skin. 1 second. Less than 1 second. But I held my breath in a way that was impossible to hide, and when I looked up at his face, I saw that he'd seen, that he'd heard, and that the information was being stored somewhere with the same meticulous care he applied to everything. He didn't step back right away. He stayed there, hand hovering near my shoulder, watching me with that expression that was almost recognition, almost memory, almost something neither of us was ready to name. "This conversation isn't over," he said at last. "I didn't start any conversation." "No." His gaze dipped for 1 second, just one, then returned to mine. "But you will." He stepped back, left the room in those slow, measured strides, and I stood in the space he'd vacated, the skin on my shoulder still registering the touch, as though his fingers had left a print. 2 days later, the world collapsed the way worlds always collapse, silently, from within, before anyone grasps the scale of the damage. Nikolai walked into the room wearing an expression I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not his usual calculated frost. Something deeper, darker, carrying the specific weight of a decision reached only after long resistance. He set a folder on the table in front of me. I opened it. Photographs, documents, names I recognized, my family's surname, debts I didn't owe but that ran through my bloodline, connections to organizations I'd spent years pretending had nothing to do with me. "You're tied to the Carvalho family," he said. "The Carvalhos owe favors to Morozov's bratva. Morozov has been my enemy for 11 years. He paused. "You didn't end up at that auction by chance." My stomach fell through the floor. "Someone placed you there on purpose," he continued, his voice dropping into that dangerous register of calm that comes just before a storm, "to reach me, through me." I wanted to say I hadn't known, that I was innocent, that Carla had used me without grasping the full picture. All of it was true, and all of it was insufficient against the look on his face. He moved toward me slowly, came around the table, stopped in front of me and held my face between both hands, not violently, but with that firm, inevitable pressure of something that won't accept deviation, and looked at me closely, so closely, with an intensity that thickened the air between us. "You wanted to escape this place?" he whispered. A pause, long enough that I could hear my own breathing. "Now you never leave." His gaze traveled across my face with deliberate slowness, brows, eyes, mouth, as though he were memorizing or recognizing, and I couldn't tell which possibility frightened me more. Then, even lower, in a voice that arrived less through the ears and more through the skin, "Tonight, you're mine." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. And the most devastating part, the part I would spend days trying to disassemble into some rational framework, was that my heart hadn't quickened from fear. He still didn't know who I was, but he was beginning to sense that he did. And when the memory finally surfaced whole, neither of us would be ready for what came with it. Chapter 4. The Edge of Fire. The wedding was announced on a Tuesday morning with the same effortless authority Nikolai applied to everything. No discussion, no preamble, no indication that he'd considered the possibility of being told no. He placed a document beside my plate, while I was still halfway through my second cup of coffee, still operating at minimum capacity, still in that hazy early morning state. That's the only window of the day when my brain isn't running active threat assessments. "Sign," he said. I looked at the document, looked at him, looked at the document again. "You're proposing to me with a contract at 7 in the morning." "I'm not proposing." That much I gathered. He sat across the table with his coffee and watched me with that patience that wasn't patience. It was the total absence of doubt about how this would end. As though my resistance were a phase he'd already factored into the schedule. I signed, not because I agreed, not because I'd surrendered, 3 years of law school had taught me that sometimes you sign the bad document to buy time for the better argument, and because the alternative was remaining in that mansion indefinitely, without even the absurd title of mob wife as future legal leverage. Strategy. It was always strategy. That's what I repeated to myself while the pen was still between my fingers, and Nikolai regarded me with an expression that sometimes resembled satisfaction, and sometimes resembled something far more complicated, something deeper, without a name I was willing to give it. The days that followed were a particular kind of torment I had no training for. Preparations. Details. A woman named Irina arrived with 3 assistants and handled both me and the event with surgical efficiency, as if coerced marriages were her area of expertise, and perhaps they were. Measurements were taken. Fabrics were paraded before me. Opinions were solicited as though I had any actual influence over the outcome. Nikolai drifted through these preparations unannounced. Sometimes for seconds, he'd cross the hallway, glance in, vanish. Other times he lingered, watching from some corner of the room with his arms folded, and that expression I'd stopped trying to interpret because the interpretation was too dangerous to be useful. And sometimes he came close. It was on one of those afternoons that the thing I'd spent days trying to prevent finally happened, not because I didn't want it, which was exactly the problem, but because wanting it constituted a betrayal of proportions I wasn't prepared to accept. Irina had gone. The assistants had gone. I was alone in the large room with the wedding dress pinned to a form in the corner, and the window casting that golden late afternoon light that makes everything look more beautiful and more trustworthy than it has any right to be. Nikolai walked in without knocking, his signature move. He paused in the doorway, watching me with that attention he never fully bothered to conceal, then crossed to where I stood near the window, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold long ago. "The dress arrived," he said. "I noticed. You didn't go look at it. I'd rather be surprised on the day, a beat, or at least pretend I'd rather be. Anything to maintain some illusion of agency over my own life." He stood 2 steps away, and the golden light struck him at an angle that made things worse, sharpening the jaw, deepening the color of his eyes, illuminating that small scar near his eyebrow I'd given up pretending not to see. He looked at me in a way that lasted too long. "Do you always look like that?" I asked, because the silence was growing unbearable, and my reflex against unbearable things is to talk. "Only when I'm thinking about dangerous things," he answered without hesitation, in that low voice that seemed to travel more through vibration than sound. I should have left it there. I know that now. "Like killing someone?" His gaze dropped for 1 second. To my mouth, only my mouth, 1 second. Then returned to mine with an expression that was almost a smile, and was infinitely more dangerous than any smile. "No." The word consumed every remaining molecule of air in the room. I set the cup on the windowsill because my hands needed something to do besides revealing that they were slightly unsteady, and when I turned back, he'd taken a single step toward me. Just one, calculated, like everything about him. "You don't trust me," I said. Not a question. I have reasons not to. And still, yes, no evasion, no apology. And still, he lifted his hand, and I went absolutely motionless as his fingers found my hair, not aggressive, not possessive, with that deliberate slowness of something being tested as it unfolds, and moved a strand from my face, with an attentiveness that held nothing casual. His fingers grazed my temple, traced the line of my face downward, stopped at my chin. That gesture again. The same specific gesture I knew from before, that existed in a memory I'd tried to lock away in unreachable places, and that now surged forward with the force of things that refused to stay buried. But this time he didn't turn my face to examine it. This time he simply stayed there, fingers on my chin and eyes on mine, and there was something different in his expression. Less calculation, more of what looked like confusion, as though he didn't entirely understand what he was doing either. "Nikolai." My voice came out quieter than I'd intended. "Don't speak," he said. Nearly an order, nearly a plea. The line between the two was impossible to locate. He tilted his head toward me, slowly, with a slowness that turned each millimeter into its own separate decision, and when he was too close for any reasonable definition of safe distance, he stopped, breathed. I could feel the heat of his breath on my skin, could see the details of his face with a clarity that only exists when 2 people are far too close, could pinpoint the exact moment something changed in his eyes, a hesitation, a question, that shadow of distrust he hadn't managed to fully extinguish. He still didn't trust me, and I still knew what he'd done. I couldn't say which of us pulled back first. It didn't matter. The result was the same. The space between us that had shrunk to almost nothing began to exist again, centimeter by painful centimeter, with that aching quality of distance you feel more sharply than distance that was never closed. He stepped back, not far, but enough for air to move between us again. He watched me for a moment with the shuttered expression he wore whenever he was processing something he didn't want to process. "You're hiding something," he said at last. Not an accusation, resigned certainty. Everyone hides something. From me, no one hides for long. I held his gaze. Is that a threat? An observation? He left with those unhurried strides of his, and I stayed where I was for a stretch of time I couldn't measure, my heart beating in a rhythm that wasn't entirely unpleasant and was entirely problematic. Pressing my back against the cold window helped, marginally. The memory surfaced that night, as it always did when my defenses dropped. Without warning, without mercy, with the brutal sharpness of things the subconscious stores more carefully than the waking mind ever could. I was 16. My father was entangled with people he had no business being near. I sensed it in the vague, frightening way children sense things their parents think they're concealing. Late meetings at home. Men who weren't invited for dinner yet occupied the sitting room for hours. Money that appeared and vanished without logic. And one night, at a gathering my father dragged me to without explaining what it was, I saw Nikolai Volkov for the first time. He was 23 then, already himself, that presence that bent the room around it, that quiet command that needed no volume. And I, 16, and carrying the specific recklessness of someone who hasn't yet learned which things deserve fear, was completely captivated. I tracked him through the party with my eyes, repositioned myself to stay close without being obvious, and was obvious naturally, because 16 and subtlety don't coexist. I tried to start a conversation, tried to exist inside his line of sight in ways that now, with the mercy of distance, made me want to retroactively vanish. Then my father did something. I still don't know the full details. I was 16, shut out of the meeting, catching only the fragments that angry adult voices let leak when they forget walls aren't soundproof. My father had tried to use my name as collateral, as currency. Had mentioned his daughter as part of some arrangement I didn't fully grasp, but that Nikolai had refused. Refused with a specific kind of coldness. "I don't involve children in business." Those exact words. I heard them through the wall with the searing clarity of things that burn on arrival. And I don't deal with men who offer daughters as collateral. Remove the family from this agreement, or remove the agreement. It wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was indifferent. And afterward, when my father emerged from that meeting, wearing the face of a man who'd lost something vital, Nikolai walked past me in the corridor without seeing me, without hesitation, without recognition, with the efficiency of someone who discards what's irrelevant and moves on, as though I were part of the furniture, as though I were invisible. At 16, the experience of being transparent to the one person you desperately want to notice, you is the kind of wound that heals crooked. It closes on the surface, stays inflamed underneath, and aches in unexpected ways when someone touches the spot without knowing it's there. My father lost the deal. To this day, I can't say whether Nikolai rejected it out of principle, out of contempt, or because men like him don't think in terms of kindness, only advantage. And my father's ruin was advantageous. After that, my father lost the protection the deal would have provided, and the cascade that followed over the years, the debts, the downward spiral, the chain of events that eventually led Carla to put me on that auction platform, had Nikolai Volkov at its origin, even if indirectly, even if unintentionally. He had refused my father on principle, and my family had drowned as a consequence. I'd spent years constructing a careful anger on that foundation, not irrational. Anger has its own logic, and had arrived at that auction with a vague, half-formed intention to get close enough to see, to understand, to decide what to do with all of it. I hadn't planned the red dress. I hadn't planned the piano. I hadn't planned to stop breathing every time he leaned too close. I rolled over on the wide mattress and stared at the ceiling at 3 a.m, with the piercing clarity that comes only when the world is silent. Nikolai Volkov had destroyed my family on principle, and I was getting dangerously close to forgetting that every time he touched my face with that impossible, unhurried tenderness. This was a problem. The bigger problem was that the part of me that should be furious was increasingly occupied trying to understand why he had hesitated too. Tomorrow was the wedding, and I still hadn't determined whether what I felt for Nikolai Volkov was the beginning of something irreversible, or the end of an anger that had kept me standing for years. Maybe it was both. Maybe that was exactly what made him so dangerous. Chapter 5. The Wedding Night. The wedding lasted 40 minutes. There were no flowers. There were arrangements. There were no guests. There were obligatory presences. Men in suits lining the walls with the posture of people on duty, not celebration. There was no music. There was silence, the collective kind that forms when many people are quiet at once for entirely different reasons. I descended the staircase in a Valentino dress. Just knowing the brand was enough to make me dizzy about the price, with white sneakers hidden underneath, because Irina had forgotten the shoes, and I'd decided it was a small enough victory to savor. Nikolai watched me come down. His eyes went straight to mine, not to the dress, not to the sneakers, to my eyes, with that undivided attention I'd stopped trying to dodge because dodging was pointless. He wore a dark suit, no tie, top button undone in the only concession to informality a man like him would permit. And there was something in his face at that moment I couldn't place. It wasn't the satisfaction of ownership. It was something quieter, more unsettling. The judge spoke. I answered. Nikolai answered. A ring appeared, cold, heavy, perfectly sized. And then it was done, carrying the silent inevitability of things decided long before they begin. The men along the walls applauded with the energy of people completing a formality. Nikolai glanced at my hand with the ring for a moment, just a moment, then looked at me with that expression I was starting to recognize as him processing something he hadn't foreseen. Done, he said, low, for my ears only. Done, I agreed, with the lightness of someone who's just signed her own sentence. Night arrived with the unhurried pace of inevitable things. The guests who weren't guests departed. The mansion grew quieter than its size warranted. I stood on the bedroom balcony, our bedroom, a phrase that still couldn't fit inside my head without tearing something, holding a glass of wine I hadn't tasted, staring down at the lit gardens and trying to arrange my thoughts into any shape that made sense. I heard the door open behind me. I didn't turn right away. I listened to the footsteps, those long, measured strides I could already identify by sound alone, and waited. He lingered in the balcony doorway for a beat. Then he came to the railing and stood beside me, looking at the same garden, saying nothing. The silence between us had shifted, heavier now, more aware of itself. Are you okay? He asked. The question caught me off guard. Not the words, but the tone. There was something beneath it that wasn't protocol, something that sounded genuine with the stiffness of a man unaccustomed to sounding genuine. I'm processing, I said honestly. I waited for more. Nothing came. So I turned to study his profile, the line of his nose, the jaw, the tension he held in his shoulders even at rest, and decided the silence had served its purpose for the night. Do you fix the dress strap of every woman you buy at auctions? I asked. He turned toward me. I've only bought one. Convenient answer. Honest answer. He looked at me in a way that began at my eyes and traveled downward, unhurried, without that cold, clinical quality of appraisal, but with that slow attentiveness that turned skin conscious of itself. Down my face, my neck, my shoulders, the line of the dress that the night breeze pressed gently against my body. Back up. Come inside, he said, low. Not an order, something else, carrying a quality I didn't yet have a word for. The room was bathed in the half-light of 2 bedside lamps, that particular golden glow that exists only at night, the kind that softens edges and makes everything one shade more intimate than daylight allows. Nikolai stood motionless in the center of the room as I entered, and there was something in that stillness that wasn't dominance. It was the specific tension of a man holding himself back. I turned to face him. Are you going to stand there all night? I'm deciding. About what? He walked toward me in those slow strides that stretched each second into its own separate anticipation, and when he stopped he was too close for ordinary conversation. Close enough for me to see his chest rise and fall, close enough for the heat coming off him to reach my skin ahead of any touch. He raised his hand, slowly, with that deliberate pace I'd come to recognize as purely his. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted, every gesture a conscious choice. His fingers found my hair, swept a strand aside with an attentiveness that had its own weight, traced down the side of my face, along my neck, and stopped where the dress strap met my shoulder. You spent the entire week provoking me, he said, low. You spent the entire week watching me. Those are different things. They're complementary things. Something shifted behind his eyes, that dark gleam that surfaced when I said something from a direction he hadn't been guarding. His fingers pressed lightly against my shoulder, descended along my arm with a slowness that made every centimeter of skin aware of the path before the touch arrived, stopped at my wrist. His fingers closed around it with a pressure that wasn't force. It was presence, the difference between holding and containing, and he was doing both at once. "Nikolai," my voice came out rougher than intended. "I hear you," he said, but didn't stop. He drew me toward him, gently, with a precision that made resistance unnecessary without making it impossible. And when we were separated by millimeters, I could feel the warmth of his breath, could see the textures of his face, with a clarity that only exists at this distance, could sense the exact moment his grip on my wrist loosened slightly, as though the cost of control was exceeding what he was willing to pay. He tilted his head. His lips grazed my temple, barely there, almost imagined, and the contact was so faint it could have been nothing at all if it weren't for the fact that my breathing stopped completely for 2 full seconds. His free hand found my waist. It didn't grab. It arrived with that firm, inevitable pressure of something settling into the place it had always belonged, fingers spread wide, claiming space, and I felt the heat of them through the fabric of the dress with a vividness that defied reason. He pulled me closer. Now there was no gap between us that could be called a gap. There was the press of his suit against my chest, the heat radiating off him in waves that preceded the touch, the edge of his jaw visible from below, with the specific closeness of standing too near, something you know is dangerous and cannot step away from. "You know I know you're hiding something," he said, his voice so low it reached me more as vibration than sound. "I know, and you know I'll find out. I know. Then why not tell me now?" His lips traced the line of my jaw, featherlight, with a precision that made the touch simultaneously tender and devastating, and I held my breath in a way that couldn't be disguised. "Because," I said, and my voice had lost some of its architecture along the way, "some things change the moment you name them." He stopped, didn't pull back, stopped, stayed exactly where he was, lips near my jaw, hand on my waist, my wrist still caught in the fingers of his other hand, and something in that pause was different from hesitation. It was recognition. He lifted his head, looked at me from very close, with those eyes that were blue and dark at the same time, and there was something I hadn't seen before, an opening, a minimal and entirely involuntary vulnerability, the kind that surfaces in people who aren't used to feeling it and therefore have no idea how to conceal it. "You know me," he said, not a question. The world stopped, not dramatically. The opposite, it stopped quietly, with the devastating weight of truths that arrive slowly after circling for a long time. I stepped back, not far. He still held my wrist. My waist still registered the ghost of his hand, but enough for the distance between us to become measurable again. "Livia." His voice had changed, less low, less soft, sharpened with the edge of someone assembling fragments in real time. "Where did you see me before?" I could have lied. I'd lied before, evaded before, built answers that were technically true and functionally hollow. But there was something in his face at that moment, that involuntary openness I'd never seen, that made dishonesty harder than it should have been. "You knew my father," I said. The silence held. I watched the moment he began assembling it, watched his jaw tighten by a fraction, watched his eyes make that rapid internal motion of someone scrolling through memory at speed, discarding, sorting, arriving. "Carvalho," he said at last. "Carvalho." He released me, not abruptly, with that cold precision of someone reorganizing internally who needs his hands free to do it. He took a step back and regarded me with an expression that had sealed shut, that impenetrable mask he wore when he wanted nothing to escape. "How old were you?" he asked. 16. Something crossed his eyes. Not regret. Nikolai Volkov clearly had a fraught relationship with regret, but something neighboring it, an adjustment, a recalibration. "You were at that party," he said. "I went with my father, and you saw me reject the deal. I heard it, through the wall." A pause. "You said you didn't involve children in business, that you didn't negotiate with men who offered their daughters as collateral." He said nothing. "It was the right thing," I said, and there was a bitterness in my voice I hadn't planned, but that rose from places I'd let ferment for years. Ethically, it was the right thing to do, but my father lost the protection that deal carried, and the chain reaction that followed, the debts, the creditors, the circumstances that eventually put me on that auction platform. It all started that night. "You blame me," he said, not defensive, simply registering. "I blamed you." The shift in tense escaped before I could catch it, arrived with an honesty I hadn't authorized, and honesty was a dangerous thing in that room on that night. I built a very specific villain inside my head over the years, with the exact face, the exact voice, the exact way of turning his back and not seeing me. Nikolai went very still. "And then I actually met you," I continued, "because I'd started, and stopping halfway would be more cowardly than finishing. And the villain stopped fitting the person. He walked to the window, stood with his back to me, looking down at the illuminated gardens, arms hanging at his sides in the posture of someone carrying more than the surface reveals. "I didn't remember you," he said at last, without turning. "At the auction. Afterward. I looked at you, and there was something that didn't match, but I couldn't." He stopped. "You were 16. I was 23 and running an organization that was regularly trying to kill me. I didn't memorize the faces of children at parties. I know. It wasn't about you. I know that too. And it was true. Intellectually, I'd always known. The problem with emotional wounds is that they don't defer to the intellect. But it produced consequences that were very much about me, even without intent." He turned, looked at me from across the room, with a distance between us that was physical and something more at the same time, and his expression held something I hadn't seen at any point during the preceding week, something that looked, for the first time, uncertain. "You came to the auction to reach me," he said. "Not exactly. I came because Carla pushed me there, but I didn't run when I could because..." I paused, breathed, because there was something I needed to understand. About you. About what I'd been carrying for so long. "And did you?" I looked at him. Tall, dark, radiating that presence that warped the room around it, wearing an expression that had closed but not entirely, eyes that sometimes read as blue and sometimes as something else I had no name for. "You weren't what I'd constructed," I said honestly. "You were worse and better at the same time, and that combination is harder to handle than a simple villain." Something passed across his face. That minimal shift I'd learned to recognize. Not a smile, but the possibility of one. The direction of one. He walked back toward me, slowly, in those strides that turned each second into a separate decision. Stopped in front of me, raised his hand and touched my face. The full palm against my cheek. Not just the fingertips, the palm with its impossible heat. And looked at me closely with an attention that had changed quality over the course of the night. Migrating from assessment to something I lacked the right word to name. "I didn't want to notice you at that party," he said, low. "Not because you were invisible, but because you were 16, and I wasn't the kind of man who looks at 16-year-old girls that way." A beat. "I ignored you because it was the right thing. And what I did about your father's deal was the right thing too. I know, but I'm looking at you now." His gaze traveled downward, slowly, fully, with an attentiveness that made touch unnecessary, because the look already carried physical weight, and returned. "And you're not 16. My heart did something that wasn't reasonable. He tilted his head. His lips found mine, not urgently, with that firm and deliberate pressure of a thing decided with care, and I went completely still for a second, before understanding the choice belonged to me as well. I chose not to step back. The kiss lasted as long as it lasted, charged with everything spoken and everything withheld, with an entire week of accumulated closeness, with years of constructed fury that had crumbled inside one honest conversation on a wedding night that hadn't planned to be truthful. When it ended, he stayed with his forehead against mine, breathing slowly. "There are still things I don't know about you," he said. "There are," I agreed. "I'm going to find out. Probably." He drew back slightly, looked at me with that expression that had opened during the night, and was now closing again, carefully, like someone who realizes they've been too exposed and needs time to reckon with what that means. "Sleep," he said. "And you?" "I have things to think about." He disappeared through the bathroom door, and I stayed where I was, in the center of the half-lit room, lips still registering the pressure of the kiss, and heart doing things I would need far more than a single night to learn to manage. I lay down on the wide bed. The ceiling was high and white and completely indifferent to everything that had just occurred. There was no more villain. There was a man who had done the right thing for the right reasons, and reaped consequences he hadn't foreseen. There was me, who had built an entire architecture of fury on a foundation more complicated than fury could hold. And there was the space between those two truths, tangled, charged, still unnamed. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow I'll decide what to do with all of this. And for the first time in a long while, I fell asleep without anger keeping me company. But some stories don't wait for you to be ready before they move forward. And what waited outside that mansion didn't know, and didn't care, that I needed time to finish what I'd come to find. Chapter 6. The Surrender. A week went by. It wasn't deliberate. Neither of us said aloud that we needed space after that night, that the conversation had wandered into territory that required time to settle before anything else could follow. It just happened, with the unspoken ease of two people who grasped the same things without having to put them into words. Nikolai left early each morning and returned late. I filled the mansion with that supervised freedom that had become my permanent condition, exploring, reading, thinking far more than was healthy for anyone. We had dinner together on the nights he came back at a reasonable hour. Those dinners carried a different quality from everything that came before, less performative tension, more honest quiet. He asked small questions. I answered. Sometimes I asked and he responded, with that brevity of speech that had stopped annoying me and started feeling like simply who he was. One evening he walked in with a criminal law textbook and set it in front of me without a word. I looked at him. "You've been complaining about having nothing to study," he said, already taking his seat. I never complained out loud. "You have a particular expression when you're intellectually bored." I opened the book before he could notice that the gesture had landed somewhere I preferred to keep guarded. The agonizing gap between us finally collapsed on a Thursday. It wasn't a grand spectacle. It was a small, almost mundane moment that held the weight of an execution. I was in the library when the afternoon sky turned a bruised purple, and a spring storm slammed into the house with sudden, violent intent. The window I'd left ajar began to rattle against the frame, threatening to shatter. I moved to seal it. Nikolai materialized in the doorway at that exact moment. He was still clad in his suit, the rigid tension of a long day etched into the broad, unyielding line of his shoulders. He crossed the room toward me with the lethal, prowling silence of a predator that didn't need to hurry because the prey had nowhere to go. We reached the window simultaneously. Our hands collided on the latch. For a heartbeat, time froze. Outside, the gale shrieked, invading the room with the sharp, metallic scent of ozone and drenched earth. His hand, massive, hot, the knuckles mapped with thick veins and faint calluses, crushed mine against the cold metal. When I looked up, my breath died in my lungs. The calculated coldness he'd worn for weeks had melted into a dark, starving hunger. It was a raw, jagged possessiveness that spoke to the ache in my own chest before I could even process the danger. He slammed the window shut with a violent, final jerk. He didn't release me. Instead, his long fingers threaded through mine, his grip so punishingly tight it felt like a brand. "Livia," he rasped. My name in that gravelly, deep timber felt like velvet dragged over broken glass. It was a sound that turned my blood to liquid fire. "I know," I whispered, my voice trembling but defiant. I did know. The very gravity of the room had warped. The months of festering distrust and cold fury had finally fermented into something lethal, a mutual, uncontrollable obsession. He turned, his massive frame blotting out the light, reducing my entire universe to the width of his chest. He reached up, his palm cupping my jaw with a firm, uncompromising pressure. His thumb ground against the frantic pulse at the base of my throat, forcing my gaze to lock onto his. "You can walk out," he murmured, a lethal, low-frequency warning. "The door is unlocked." "I know. Then why are you still standing here?" I stared into those eyes. Icy blue stones darkened into midnight by pure lust. I saw the tight set of his jaw and the muscle leaping in his cheek. He was balanced on the razor's edge of his sanity, and I was the one pushing him over. "For the same reason you won't open that door for me," I challenged, tilting my head back, baring my throat to his touch. Something inside Nikolai snapped. The mask of the controlled businessman disintegrated. His hand tightened on my neck, implacable and possessive, and he shoved me backward. My spine hit the solid mahogany of the bookshelf with a jarring thud. The rows of heavy volumes shuddered, but neither of us cared. His mouth crashed into mine. It wasn't a kiss. It was a siege. Unlike the calculated restraint of the past, this was brutal, a collision of teeth, heat, and desperation. Nikolai invaded my mouth with his tongue, drinking in my surrender while a broken, needy whimper vibrated in my throat. He tasted of bitter espresso, cool mint, and the dark, intoxicating danger I had spent weeks trying to outrun. His hand tore a path down my body, his fingers hooking into the thin fabric of my blouse, gripping my waist with a pressure so intense I knew I'd be marked with his fingerprints by morning. He hoisted me up, crushing my soft curves against the granite-hard planes of his chest. I could feel every tensed muscle through his expensive suit, his body radiating heat like a furnace. My fingers dug into his shoulders, bunching the dark fabric of his jacket, pulling him closer even as he buried his face in my neck. His stubble burned my skin, and his teeth nipped at the exact spot where my pulse was thundering, marking his territory in the middle of the library. "Mine," he growled against my jugular, the vibration of his voice sending a violent surge of electricity straight to my core. You've driven me to the brink of madness for weeks. Now, you're going to deal with the consequences." In one fluid movement of terrifying strength, he caught me by the thighs, my legs locked around his hips by primal instinct as he carried me down the shadowed hallway. He didn't stop devouring my mouth for a single second. When my back hit the mattress in the darkened bedroom, he was already looming over me. The roar of the storm outside was drowned out by the frantic rhythm of our breathing and the sound of clothes being stripped and discarded with desperate, violent haste. Nikolai's body in the gloom was a masterpiece of corded muscle and silvered scars. When we finally met, skin to skin, the thermal shock of his searing heat against my body made me arch my spine in a silent plea. He was not gentle. He didn't give me a moment to catch my breath. Nikolai took what was his with a crushing, absolute intensity, burying himself deep inside me and filling every empty space. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic, and punishing pace that ripped shameless, raw moans from my lungs. His hands pinned my wrists to the pillow above my head, his eyes boring into mine in the dark, watching the way I shattered under him again and again until the world narrowed down to his touch, his scent, and the sweat slicking our joined bodies. Later, much later, the storm had bled out into a soft, rhythmic rain. "You can leave," he said again, his voice a low, subterranean rumble against my temple. But the edge was gone. The threat had been replaced by a hoarse, raw vulnerability, a crack in the armor of a man who never showed his heart. I lifted my head to look at him. In the faint amber glow of the street lamps filtering through the curtains, his eyes were fixed on me with an expression I knew no one else had ever seen. He looked disarmed, defeated. "You don't want me to leave," I stated. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. "No," a single syllable, an admission of total surrender from a man who lived to rule. He was admitting his complete undoing at the hands of the woman lying across his chest. I settled my face back into the hollow of his shoulder, my hand tracing the rigid muscles of his chest. Then it settled. I felt the ghost of a smile against the crown of my head, as his tension finally, infinitesimally, began to bleed away. "Do you still think you can escape me, Livia?" he asked, his voice dropping into a dark, possessive register that made my stomach flip. I thought about the weeks of torture, the suffocating tension, the brutal claiming in the library, and the way he had just ruthlessly unmade me in that bed. "I could," I sighed, closing my eyes. A long pause followed. "But I don't think I want to." His hand tightened in my hair, a sharp, intentional reminder that even if I tried, he would never let go. I closed my eyes. The rain kept falling outside, steady and rhythmic, cradling the dangerous surrender we had both chosen, the kind of moment you wish could stretch on forever. But tomorrow would arrive, carrying secrets and contracts neither of us wanted to face. This chapter had already closed, but what lay ahead was only just beginning. Lena here. That wraps up Book 1, and I've already finished Book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. It was the vibration that woke me, discreet, repeated, insistent the way messages are when whoever sends them knows you're sleeping and doesn't care. I grabbed my phone without thinking, without opening my eyes completely, with that disorientation of interrupted sleep. Unknown number, text message, short. I opened it. "You finally got to him." I sat up in bed with my heart in my throat, suddenly completely awake. Second message, sent 30 seconds after the first. "Now let's see how willing you are to destroy him." I stayed motionless in the dark, with the phone illuminating my face, with my heart beating in a way that wasn't reasonable, with Nikolai sleeping beside me with that slow breathing of someone who had finally lowered their guard. Someone had always known where I was, and the past, mine, his, what was between us and what was still outside waiting, hadn't ended. It had only waited. And there's a problem. I still hadn't decided, because I also knew that Nikolai didn't choose me by chance, that he still hides from me. Like I said, that was just a taste of Book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and Book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side.